I've always been an optimistic person. I'm not the type to sink into long moods, to cling to depression, or to spend nights drowning in self-pity. I bend, I adapt, I stay open. At my core, I'm a happy person. I don't linger on pain, I don't wallow in it, and I don't complain just to be heard. Even in my darkest moments, I still manage to find a way to laugh out loud. That was my nature. They called her the Queen of Rock and Roll, the woman whose voice could shake stadiums and whose resilience made the whole world bow. But behind that royal title lay a cruel, unspoken truth Tina Turner carried like a scar. She was beaten, betrayed, and turned into a marionette by the very industry that once worshipped her. When she finally broke free from that private hell, Tina said something that chilled those who listened closely. Music, she believed, doesn't just create legends. It also feeds demons. Before she passed away, she was said to have drawn up a list that had never been made public. 10 artists she believed embodied the darkest side of the business. 10 people who, in her memory, turned music into a weapon that crushed spirits and devoured souls. Who were they, really? Icons the world adored, or masks worn by something far more sinister? And what could have driven Tina Turner, one of history's greatest performers, to speak so openly before her final curtain fell? The answers begin with the first name on her list. 1. Ike Turner, the man who turned love into a prison. The first name Tina marked down was no mystery to the world. He was the man who discovered her, the man who loved her, the man who controlled her, and the man who almost erased her. His name was Ike Turner, once praised in music circles as a pioneer, a father of rock and roll. But in Tina's life story, he was the first face of evil in music. It started like a fairy tale. In 1957, a 17-year-old girl named Anna Mae Bullock walked into Club Manhattan in St. Louis, where Ike was on stage playing guitar with his band, the Kings of Rhythm. When she asked if she could sing, the room grew quiet. Ike stopped. Musicians stared. Her voice cut through the smoke, raw, aching, and full of the southern sorrow she carried in her bones. In that moment, Ike didn't just hear a girl, he heard power. He pulled her into his orbit, and from that night on, her life slowly stopped belonging to her. Ike changed her name to Tina Turner, a name he made sure he could legally own. He said it was just good branding, but in reality, it was possession written in ink. Tina wasn't just a woman anymore. She was a trademark, an asset. Together, Ike and Tina Turner became one of the most explosive duos in rhythm and blues, symbols of passion, sweat, and unstoppable energy. They delivered classics like A Fool in Love, Proud Mary, and It's Gonna Work Out Fine, shaking stages across the country. The crowd saw only electricity and chemistry. But behind the curtain, the story was different. A relationship twisted by power, jealousy, and obsession. According to people who worked with them, Ike couldn't stand watching Tina's star rise higher than his. He monitored her every move, controlled who she spoke to, and where she went. Band members recalled that Ike had a stare so cold it could silence a room without a single word. When pressure built, he lashed out, smashing instruments, stopping shows mid-performance, turning the studio into a battlefield where everyone walked on broken glass. The more success they tasted, the deeper Ike sank into drugs and paranoia. He became convinced that everyone, record executives, journalists, even Tina herself, was plotting to push him aside. Rumors spread that he forced Tina to sign contracts, keeping her chained to the group, documents that made it nearly impossible for her to walk away without losing her right to perform. Tina's life split into two realities. On stage, she was a global star, wild, free, and unstoppable. Off stage, she was a terrified woman who calculated every word, every step, just to avoid setting him off. The breaking point began to form in 1966 when legendary producer Phil Spector invited Tina to record River Deep, Mountain High. Spector demanded that Ike stay out of the studio. The recording session stretched nearly 22 hours. Tina sang as though her entire soul were being wrung out. Spector layered the track with walls of sound, but for Ike, the real blow came later. The finished record was celebrated in Europe as a masterpiece. Critics praised Tina's voice, her voice alone. For Ike, It was humiliation, a public reminder that she could shine without him. He spiraled deeper into rage and instability. By the mid-1970 seconds, Ike's mind was consumed by addiction and delusion. He ruled his band like a cult leader. No one dared question him. Tina was exhausted, physically bruised, emotionally empty, performing night after night just to keep the fragile peace from shattering. In 1976, during a tour stop in Dallas, everything finally detonated. After a violent argument in a limousine, Tina realized something with terrifying clarity. If she didn't leave now, she might never leave alive. That night, while Ike slept in their hotel room, she made her choice. She slipped out with no cash, no luggage, only a gas card, and the courage she had left. She ran through the night, across a highway, into the fluorescent loneliness of a small roadside motel. She begged the owner for a room, promising she would pay him back. When the sun rose over Dallas, it didn't just mark a new day. It marked the end of Ike and Tina Turner as the world knew them. After Tina walked away, Ike's empire crumbled. He lost contracts, lost his band, and watched his reputation collapse under the weight of his own history. In 1986, Tina released her memoir, I, Tina, laying bare the years of violence and control. The world was stunned. Ike denied everything, but denial couldn't resurrect the life he had already burned down. In 2007, Ike Turner died at 76 from complications related to drugs. To the public, he was still often described as a musical genius, a man who helped shape an entire genre. But for Tina, he remained something else entirely, her deepest wound. The man who turned love into a prison, music into a source of terror, and who taught her a lesson she never forgot. In this industry, evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the person who swears they love you the most. 2. Phil Spector, the genius with a gun. The second name on Tina Turner's private list was not a lover, not a husband, but a man who showed her that genius and madness could live in the same body and sometimes share the same heartbeat. His name was Phil Spector, the legendary producer of the 1960 Seconds, who reshaped the sound of modern music with what the world called his wall of sound. But behind the awards and headlines, there was a mind consumed by control, obsession, and a quiet, calculated terror. From a young age, Spector was hailed as a sound magician. He crafted recordings that felt like explosions in small rooms, dense layers of instruments, and echo that hit like a controlled detonation. To outsiders, he was a visionary. But those who worked under him said he was something else entirely. He didn't just produce songs, he owned them. Every snare hit, every string line, every breath a singer took had to bend to his will. Anyone who resisted, it was said, quickly learned what it meant to regret it. In 1966, when Spector heard Tina Turner's voice on the radio, he reportedly said he had found the volcano he'd been searching for. According to accounts from the time, he approached Ike Turner with an unusual offer, $20,000 in exchange for one condition. Ike would stay out of the studio. Spector wanted Tina's voice, but not Ike's presence, not his shadow, not his control. That decision led to one of the most infamous recording sessions in music history. River Deep, Mountain High. The session would stretch out over nearly 22 hours. Spector packed the Gold Star Studios in Los Angeles with dozens of microphones and more than 20 musicians, building a maze of overlapping sound. The doors were closed, the clocks were removed, time itself disappeared. Light boiled down to one focus, Tina. She stood in front of the microphone, headphones clamped on, as the room filled with smoke and tension. Take after take, she pushed her voice until it felt like it was tearing free from her chest. Each time she finished, Spector adjusted something, boosted the drums, buried another guitar, lifted the strings higher, pushed the volume until the walls vibrated. No one asked how long they'd been there. No one dared. Witnesses later described Spector pacing behind the mixing console, hands trembling, eyes wide, breathing heavy, like a man on the edge of something only he could see. Beside him on the table, a handgun reportedly gleamed under the yellow studio light. He barely spoke. He didn't have to. Just resting his fingers on the weapon was enough of a message. Control did not need words. By the time the recording finally stopped, the people in that room were drained. Tina's voice was almost gone, scraped raw by hours of relentless singing. Musicians slumped in their chairs, engineers rubbed their eyes. Spector just stood there, silent. Then he smiled. He said they had done it, the perfect sound. For him, it was triumph. For Tina, it was 22 hours of fear wrapped in music. River Deep, Mountain High became a sensation in Europe, hailed by critics as a masterpiece, a sonic cathedral. But in the United States, it underperformed. The American charts did not respond the way Spector believed they should. According to reports, that failure wounded him deeply, cutting into his pride like a blade. From that moment, he began to pull away from the outside world. He withdrew into his mansion in Los Angeles, turning it into a fortified shrine to his own legacy, a private kingdom built on hit records, mirrors, and paranoia. Visitors later described the house as a maze of corridors lined with gold records, high fences, and locked gates. It was said he would wander the halls with a gun in his hand, talking to the walls as if the echoes of his past productions were talking back. But what Tina Turner never forgot were the stories whispered by other musicians. Singers said he would lock them in studios for hours, forcing them to perform in near darkness, cutting them off from the outside world until they broke down in tears. It was claimed that he believed true emotion only came when a person had nothing left to hide. For Phil Spector, every song was a war, and only he was allowed to win no matter what it cost those standing in front of the microphone. The horror of his world reached its most public point in 2003. Actress Lana Clarkson was found dead inside Spector's mansion. He was arrested at the scene. Investigators later described the house as something like a museum of obsession and fear, mirrored walls, scattered bullet casings, old photographs, tape reels, and cassettes stacked like relics to a vanished era. After years of legal battles, Spector was convicted of manslaughter in 2009. The verdict ended the career of a man who had once been called a genius of sound. Behind bars, far from his studio and the echo chambers that made him famous, the legend simply faded into a grim reality. Phil Spector died in prison in 2021. To many, he remains a complex figure, a visionary who changed how records were made. But in Tina Turner's memory, he was something more chilling, a refined version of Ike Turner. No fists, no public screaming, no messy outbursts, just control, fear, power over the human soul exercised through the thin wire of a microphone and the cold barrel of a gun resting nearby. The story of Phil Spector is not only the tragedy of one man's fall. It is a reminder that in the music industry, madness often hides behind the word genius. And sometimes the songs that echo through the world are built on the silent breaths of people singing through terror. 3. Berry Gordy, the tycoon of enslaved souls. The next man on Tina Turner's list didn't need his fists, a weapon, or a raised voice to ruin anyone. All he needed was a charming smile, a polished contract, and a steady hand holding a pen. Berry Gordy, founder of Motown Records, was celebrated as the business mastermind who turned black music into a global empire. But in Tina's memory, he also represented something darker, a master of quiet control who, according to many artists, bound souls with laws, signatures, and silence. The story began in Detroit in 1959, inside a modest house at 2648 West Grand Boulevard. Berry Gordy turned that house into Motown, a place he reportedly called the Hit Factory. Young singers walked in as raw talent and walked out as polished stars. He didn't just sign artists, he reshaped them. They were taught how to speak in interviews, how to smile on cue, how to walk, sit, and even how to hold a microphone. They weren't just musicians, they were products, refined and packaged for mass consumption. In Gordy's system, everything and everyone was measured by profit. That cold, efficient logic made him one of the most powerful figures in American music history. But power, especially in an industry built on dreams, always casts long shadows. Inside the Motown building, it was said that dozens of artists signed contracts without fully understanding what they were giving away. Many later claimed those agreements stated that every song, Every recording, every performance right would belong to the company permanently. According to people close to the label, anyone who pushed back or asked too many questions didn't argue for long. They simply disappeared from the spotlight. One of the first and most tragic examples often mentioned was Florence Ballard, the founding member of the Supremes. When she reportedly questioned missing money and unfair treatment, she was removed from the group in what felt like an instant. Her fame evaporated. Friends said she sank into alcohol and despair. She died in poverty at 32, while Diana Ross, Gordy's star protege and rumored lover, continued her rise to global superstardom. The connection between Berry Gordy and Diana Ross was an open secret in Detroit and later in Hollywood. As the Supremes reached their peak, Gordy allowed Ross to go solo under a multi-million-dollar deal. Motown, some insiders said, was no longer simply a record label. It had become Berry Gordy's kingdom, and Diana Ross was the unquestioned queen. Years later, when Ross gave birth to her first son, reports circulated that Gordy might be the father. Neither of them publicly confirmed that story, but the rumor added another shadow to the already complicated power dynamic. Other Motown legends also felt the cost of Gordy's control. Marvin Gaye, often referred to as the soul of Motown, brought Gordy an album called What's Going On, a raw, emotional project about war, pain, and the state of the world. Gordy, according to multiple accounts, called it too political, too heavy, and bad for business. He initially refused to release it. When Marvin insisted, some said Gordy saw it as rebellion. The album eventually became one of the most celebrated in music history, but the relationship between Marvin Gaye and Motown fractured. Gaye left the label with bitterness, legal battles, and heavy debts trailing him like chains, which many believed were Motown's silent way of making sure no one forgot who held the real power. By the 1972, when Motown moved from Detroit to Los Angeles, Berry Gordy's influence reached its peak. He expanded into film and television, shook hands with Hollywood's elite, and built an image of himself as the man who had brought black music into America's living rooms. While he mingled with new stars on the West Coast, many of the old Motown heroes faded into the background. Mary Wells, the voice behind My Guy, was said to have lost the rights to much of her work and the royalties that should have followed. David Ruffin of The Temptations was reportedly fired after demanding fair pay and proper credit. The same voices that built the Motown sound became ghosts in the very house they helped construct. In the early 1972, Berry Gordy crossed paths with Tina Turner at a fragile moment in her life. She had just left Ike, carrying scars the public couldn't see, and was searching for a way to rebuild. According to people close to her, Gordy offered Tina a management deal that sounded like salvation. He promised to make her the undisputed queen of Motown, another crown in his empire. But there was a price. The deal, Tina realized, would give Gordy immense control over her career and image. And after everything she had survived, she recognized the pattern. When Gordy sensed she wasn't someone he could fully mold, the atmosphere reportedly turned cold. The meeting ended. Before she walked out, he told her, "No one survives alone in this business." To most, it might have sounded like advice. To Tina, it felt like a warning. Years later, as she looked back, Tina Turner said Berry Gordy represented a different kind of power, one that didn't need bruises or screaming matches. He used legal documents instead of fists, fine print instead of threats. His empire moved with the precision of a perfect machine, but that machine, in her eyes, crushed the souls locked inside it. Today, Motown is praised as an American cultural treasure, a symbol of progress and black excellence. Its songs play at weddings, on radio stations, in films, bright memories of another era. But behind those shimmering melodies, Tina believed there were countless untold stories. Contracts signed in confusion, careers quietly strangled, silent funerals, and artists who once burned bright before vanishing without explanation. Berry Gordy is honored in history books as the man who opened doors for black music, yet in Tina Turner's memory, he also stood as the cold face of a particular kind of evil, the man who could turn passion into pure profit, and living, breathing artists into souls forever bound to music they no longer truly owned. 4. James Brown, the king on stage, the devil backstage. Now we arrive at a legend before whom the world once bowed. James Brown, the godfather of soul, the man whose voice, grooves, and raw rhythm helped carve the shape of modern American music. Crowds saw a myth in motion, but Tina Turner once said that only the people standing behind the curtains ever truly knew who James Brown was. Because when the lights went out, the saint on stage became something else entirely. In 1968, Tina Turner and her band joined James Brown on tour, one of the biggest musical events of that era. On stage, he was pure voltage. Dressed in a blazing red suit, dripping sweat, sliding, spinning, dropping to his knees as if struck by lightning. The crowd screamed his name like a prayer. Every movement, every scream into the microphone felt like a man wrestling the music itself. But the moment he stepped off stage, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy. The rules changed. Backstage, James Brown demanded that everyone stand when he passed. No one spoke unless spoken to. Jokes were dangerous. If anyone dared laugh while he was talking, they were thrown out immediately. Respect wasn't requested, it was enforced. One night in Atlanta, as Tina was preparing to go on stage, she watched a scene that would stay with her forever. James Brown was in rehearsal, tightening his show to the second, when he suddenly noticed one of Tina's dancers laughing quietly at the side of the stage. He stopped everything. Without a word, he hurled a microphone straight at the girl. The impact wasn't what froze the room, it was his face. Tina rushed forward, ready to step in, but stopped when she saw his eyes. They weren't the eyes of an artist in the middle of a performance. They were the eyes of a man who believed he held the power of life and death over everyone around him. After that night, Tina said she saw what the audience never could. James Brown was so possessed by power that somewhere along the way, he had lost his humanity. He could not tolerate the slightest loss of control. Even with his own band, he reportedly fined musicians on the spot for being offbeat by a fraction of a second. A James Brown concert, from the audience's view, was a celebration. But behind the scenes, it looked more like a drill commanded by a general obsessed with discipline. The music was real, but so was the domination. By the mid-1970 seconds, Brown's life began sliding into a downward spiral. Cocaine and delusion made him increasingly unpredictable. According to stories from those around him, he once stopped his car in the middle of the road just to scream at his driver for playing the wrong song. Another time, he allegedly forced his band to play all night long because, as he put it, the sound hasn't reached God yet. His outbursts became more frequent, and the title, Godfather of Soul, slowly twisted into something darker, a reminder of a genius lost inside his own divine fantasy. Then came 1988. James Brown led police on a high-speed chase across Georgia, gun in hand, with drugs in the car. When he was finally arrested, the image of him in a prison jumpsuit, head bowed, flickered across televisions around the world. The same man who had once been held up as a symbol of black pride and musical brilliance was now branded a criminal. When he was released, Brown claimed he had been reborn, that prison had changed him. But the truth, at least in Tina's eyes, was that he never fully escaped the demons that had followed him for decades. Tina Turner not only saw his public fall, she felt the echo of his story in her own life. Both she and Brown carried wild, burning energy on stage. The difference, she believed, was in what they did with it. James Brown turned that energy into control. In his mind, he wasn't just part of the music, he was the music. He believed he was a god everyone around him had to obey. Tina knew the cost of that belief all too well. She had lived through another man who thought he owned her, body and soul. In his final years, James Brown lived largely alone in his South Carolina mansion. He faced lawsuits, bitter financial disputes, and, according to reports, rumors that someone might have poisoned him before his death on Christmas Day, 2006. No one knows for sure if he ever found peace in those last days. What is certain is that the voice that once set the world on fire finally faded into a lonely darkness. Tina Turner called it the price paid by a man who thought he was God. In her eyes, James Brown wasn't evil simply because he was cruel or unpredictable. He was dangerous because he believed the spotlight was the light of heaven when, in truth, it was the same fire that slowly burned his soul away. 5. Diana Ross, the Queen of Betrayal. On Tina Turner's list, the person who cut her the deepest wasn't the man who beat her. It was the woman who once stood under the same lights, sharing the same crown, the same whispered title, Queen. That woman was Diana Ross, the polished face of Motown glamour, adored across America as the embodiment of beauty, elegance, and power. To the world, Diana Ross was perfection. To Tina, she came to represent a different kind of evil. One wrapped not in violence, but in ambition, applause, and a smile that never quite reached the eyes. Both women started from the same place. Poverty, struggle, and doors slammed shut because of the color of their skin. Both clawed their way up through hostile rooms and rigged systems. But when the spotlight finally opened for them, they chose different paths. Tina climbed through pain and relentless work. Ross, in Tina's eyes, climbed through calculation, timing, and proximity to power. Their paths collided in Hollywood, where Motown ruled the airwaves and Berry Gordy quietly reigned over the scene like a king without a visible crown. In the late 1960 seconds, during a glittering Motown gala, Tina, then at the height of her fame with Ike Turner, was invited to open the show. She set the stage on fire as always, leaving the crowd roaring. Then Diana Ross arrived. She swept into the venue in a shimmering silver gown, surrounded by assistants and handlers. When Tina finished her set, Ross stepped out, took the microphone straight from the host's hand, and congratulated her with two polite, sharp words, "Dear colleague." The audience applauded the moment as a gesture of sisterhood. But those standing close enough to see Ross's expression noticed something else. Her eyes were distant, cold, almost hollow. She gave the band a subtle signal. The music shifted. Without waiting for Tina's closing notes to fully fade, Ross began to sing over them. The room went momentarily stiff, caught between confusion and awe. Tina didn't need anyone to explain what had just happened. That wasn't generosity. It was a declaration, a quiet way of saying, there can only be one queen. After that night, Tina felt the doors begin to move behind her back. Gordy, it was said, quietly blocked her from any major show where Diana Ross was scheduled to appear. Television producers were told the two women were too similar in image, a polite and vague excuse that served one purpose: keep Ross alone at the top. While Tina exhausted herself on the road, trapped in a personal hell with Ike, Ross appeared on the covers of Time, Vogue, and other major magazines. Her solo career protected and powered by Gordy, Tina's former lover, and now Ross's strongest ally. When Tina finally escaped Ike and found herself in freefall, broke, traumatized, uncertain if she would ever return, Diana Ross was shining brighter than ever. In 1977, during a live broadcast in New York, the host casually mentioned Tina Turner's attempt at a comeback. Ross smiled, looked straight into the camera, and said softly, "Everyone has their time." The studio laughed. The line was light, almost harmless on the surface. But for Tina, watching that moment, it felt like a blade sliding between old wounds. It wasn't the humiliation that hurt the most. It was the realization. Ross didn't need to destroy anyone with threats or fists. All she had to do was stand in the center of the light and let others disappear into the shadows around her. Years later, in 1984, when Tina roared back with Private Dancer and reclaimed a throne the industry thought she'd lost forever, the media began framing the two women as rivals in headlines and photo spreads. Queen versus Queen. Tina versus Diana. Ross said nothing publicly. But at major award shows and industry events, a pattern quietly appeared. Each time Tina was scheduled to perform, Ross was often gone before Tina hit the stage. The press whispered about it, calling it the Cold War of the Queens. No open feud, no direct shots, just the quiet chill between two women who had once shared a dream. Then came 1991. Tina Turner was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Flowers, letters, and messages poured in from nearly every corner of the music world, from friends, peers, even former rivals. Everyone acknowledged the woman who had survived the unthinkable and risen higher than ever. Everyone except Diana Ross. When asked, Ross's publicist simply said she was busy performing in Las Vegas that night. On paper, it was a scheduling conflict, but to those who understood the history, it felt like the final, deliberate silence. Tina never publicly attacked Diana Ross. She never called for revenge or tried to humiliate her in interviews. But people close to Tina noticed that whenever Ross's name came up, something in her eyes shifted, growing distant, shadowed, quietly hurt. To Tina Turner, Diana Ross wasn't a classic enemy. She was something more unsettling, a symbol of the most painful kind of betrayal, the kind that doesn't come with yelling, threats, or blows, but hides behind applause, polite smiles, and perfectly controlled gestures. If Ike Turner had made Tina afraid of men, Diana Ross made her lose faith in women. Because in that world, Tina realized, evil didn't always clench a fist. Sometimes it glided in a designer gown, walked calmly down a red carpet, and answered only to one name: Queen. 6. Rick James, the genius consumed by desire. Rick James was once hailed as the king of funk, a wild, dangerous symbol of the 1,980 seconds. To millions, he was an untamed icon, loud, colorful, and unstoppable. But to Tina Turner, he wasn't just another star. He was a living warning, a portrait of what happens when a brilliant soul burns for too long inside its own fire. Their paths crossed in 1981 at a Grammy afterparty in Los Angeles. The room was thick with smoke, perfume, and industry power players. Then Rick James walked in. He wore a red leather jacket that caught the light with every step, heavy gold chains stacked around his neck, and an attitude that hit the room before he did. People didn't simply look at him, they moved out of his way. He wasn't charming in the usual sense. He was something else, magnetic, volatile, with an energy that felt like a live wire. Tina later said his eyes seemed darker than the room itself, like he was standing half in the party and half in some other more dangerous place. At that time, Rick James was at the top of his world. Super Freak was everywhere, booming from car stereos, clubs, and the new glowing screens of MTV. Music magazines called him the last untamed flame of funk, a rebel who refused to be polished or controlled. But behind those images, the reality was harsher. According to journalists and visitors, his Hollywood Hills mansion didn't feel like a home. It felt like a place where time had been erased. Curtains stayed closed, neon lights glowed at all hours. Music throbbed through the walls without stopping. Guests drifted in and out, rarely sober, their days and nights swallowed by cocaine, alcohol, and chaos. By the mid-1980 seconds, the empire he had built on hit records and pure attitude was beginning to crack. Collaborators left, his record label distanced itself. Instead of slowing down, Rick James dove deeper into the spiral. He was arrested multiple times over violent outbursts, damaged hotel rooms, fights that exploded without warning. Newspapers began calling him one of the most lost souls in American music. The man who once seemed in control of the storm now looked like he was trapped inside it. Then came 1991, the scandal that would define his downfall. Rick James and his girlfriend, Tanya Hijazi, were arrested in Los Angeles after being accused of kidnapping and assaulting 2 women. The story hit the front pages and did not let go. Court documents and testimony painted a picture of a man reportedly high for days, unmoored from reality, trying to bend other lives to his will. The booking photo of Rick James in a prison jumpsuit, his once proud braids hanging over a hollow, exhausted face, spread across TV and print. The funk legend who had strutted across stages in leather and lace was now an inmate, his name no longer attached to hit songs but to criminal charges. He was convicted and served a prison sentence of more than 2 years. When he was released, he tried to restart his career. There were shows, attempts at comebacks, small flashes of the old fire, but the crowds were thinner, the headlines softer, the excitement gone. The industry had moved on. His body had paid its own price. Years of drugs and excess had chewed away at his health. On an August morning in 2004, Rick James was found dead in his sleep at the age of 56. The autopsy listed heart failure with traces of multiple substances still in his system. No explosive final act, no dramatic scene, just a quiet, irreversible end to a life that had been anything but quiet. For Tina Turner, there was no joy in his fall. She didn't speak of him with contempt. She saw him as a child of his time, a man whose creative energy had spun so violently it finally devoured him. To her, Rick James represented the evil of unchecked desire, the way addiction twists talent into something monstrous, how cravings for pleasure, escape, and power can swallow a person whole. He was a radiant soul burned alive by his own flame, a reminder that in the music world, not all demons come from outside. Sometimes they rise from within the artists themselves. 7. Quincy Jones, the manipulator in the shadows. In the music world, few people have ever held more long-lasting influence than Quincy Jones. He was the architect behind Thriller, the best-selling album of all time, the man behind Olympic ceremonies, legendary film scores, and dozens of Grammys. To the public, he was the master builder of modern pop culture. But to Tina Turner, he was remembered as something far more unsettling, a man who, in her view, knew how to own souls without ever having to lay a hand on them. In the 1,980 seconds, when Tina had finally clawed her way out of Ike Turner's darkness, Quincy Jones appeared with an offer that sounded like destiny. She was free, but fragile, famous, but rebuilding. That was when Quincy approached her and said she needed professional hands to guide the next phase of her global comeback. At that moment in time, Quincy was not just a producer, he was a power center. One phone call from him, people said, could create a career or quietly erase it. Tina met him in a private room in Beverly Hills. The walls glittered with framed gold and platinum records, each one bearing the names of giants: Michael Jackson, Donna Summer, Lionel Richie. Photos lined the shelves. Quincy smiling beside presidents, movie stars, music icons. It felt less like an office and more like a throne room. He laid out a plan for her, a carefully designed blueprint for an international career. World tours, top-tier producers, strategic media appearances. It was all printed, organized, and mapped to perfection. Then came the condition. According to people familiar with that moment, Quincy's team wanted complete creative control over her music and image. Every song choice, every stylistic shift, every public move would be filtered through his vision. Tina read the details. The plan was flawless on paper, but there was one problem. Somewhere inside all those pages, Tina Turner herself began to disappear. She refused. What happened next was never written down. But according to later accounts, the air around her started to change. Concerts that once seemed secure were suddenly canceled. Television spots were quietly postponed. Record discussions she had counted on were put on hold. No one said why. No one mentioned Quincy's name. But in an industry that runs on whispers and invisible lines of power, the message felt clear. It was said that crossing Quincy Jones didn't require a warning. You simply felt the system step away from you. Stories from other artists only deepened that impression. From Michael Jackson to Lionel Richie, several of his collaborators hinted that Quincy's reach went far beyond the recording studio. By the time Thriller exploded into the world, he was seen not just as a producer, but as an untouchable godfather of American entertainment, linked to record labels, television networks, sponsors, and even political figures. His influence, according to reports, moved quietly through boardrooms and backrooms alike. Tina chose a different path. She chose independence, even if it meant walking without the protection of a giant like Quincy Jones. But she never forgot that meeting or the chill that followed it. She would later say that Quincy didn't need to shout, threaten, or show anger. He ruled with intellect, charm, and the comforting illusion of safety he offered to those who stepped under his wing. Artists believed they were being guided, protected, elevated. Only later, some claimed, did they realize they had simply become pieces on a board he controlled from a distance. To the rest of the world, Quincy Jones remains a legend, a genius whose fingerprints are on some of the greatest works in modern music. But in Tina Turner's memory, he took on a different shape, the man in the shadows. A kind of power you never actually see, but always feel. No open threats, no scandals, no visible harm, just a smile, a handshake, and then the quiet sensation that the entire system is rearranging itself around him. On Tina's list, Quincy was not painted as the loudest or the cruelest. He did not appear as the one who screamed, hit, or publicly melted down, but he was the one, she believed, who frightened her the most. Because through him, she saw a truth far colder than violence. In the world of music, evil doesn't always come wrapped in rage. Sometimes it comes dressed in intelligence, strategy, and a calm, steady confidence. The kind that convinces people they are acting on their own, even as invisible hands guide every step they take. 8. David Bowie, the man who danced with darkness. There was one artist who unnerved Tina Turner not with rage or violence, but with something colder, a quiet, otherworldly chill that followed him into every room. That artist was David Bowie. He didn't hit, he didn't shout, he didn't control with contracts or fists. He bent reality with presence alone, manipulating the world with a charm that felt almost supernatural. When they worked together on Tonight in 1985, Tina had only recently escaped the years of torment with Ike. She walked into that collaboration believing she was standing beside a friend, a brilliant mind, a fellow survivor of the industry. But the closer she stood to Bowie, the more the temperature seemed to drop. His mismatched eyes, one blue, one gray, looked striking on stage, but up close, Tina felt there was something unsettling behind them. He spoke little, watched long, and moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if he'd stepped out of a dream no one else could see. Standing near him, she sometimes felt less like she was talking to another musician, and more like she was in the presence of something she couldn't quite name. By that time, the music world was already thick with rumors about Bowie. Some people claimed he believed he was haunted by demons. It was said that he scattered salt around his pool to keep them away and held midnight rituals with candles and tapes played backward. One studio engineer later alleged that he had walked in on Bowie standing in a trance, drawing Kabbalistic symbols on the wall and singing in a low voice, like he was summoning something only he could hear. According to those stories, art was never just art for him. It was a doorway. Tina once attended a party in London where Bowie presented what he called a sound ritual. The lights were cut, the chatter died instantly. A deep bass note began to pulse through the room, heavy and slow, while smoke curled through the air like fingers. Bowie stood at the center, eyes closed, moving with a strange, deliberate slowness, his body swaying as if controlled by an unseen hand. When the sound stopped, the smoke thinned. Bowie opened his eyes and smiled softly. No one applauded. No one knew if they had just seen a performance, a joke, or something else entirely. Tina said she felt a shiver run up her spine, like she had just watched a soul step out of its own body and then force itself back in. To her, David Bowie came to represent the kind of evil that appears when an artist believes art only matters once it crosses every moral line. He didn't kill anyone, but in Tina's view, he killed something more fragile innocence in music. The idea that songs could simply be songs, untouched by darkness. When Bowie died in 2016, the world mourned a genius, a visionary who had reinvented himself again and again. Tina, according to those close to her, summed it up differently. He saw too much, and he never truly found his way back. 9. Prince, the man who made himself God. If David Bowie flirted with darkness, Prince lived inside it. To Tina Turner, he wasn't just another superstar, he was the final warning. In her mind, when a musician starts to believe he is God, sooner or later the art he worships comes back to claim him. Tina met Prince during a European tour in the early 1980 seconds. On stage, he appeared like a purple apparition backlit by a halo of white light, his face cool, his body moving as though some unseen force was pulling the strings. The guitar screamed, the crowd lost control, and he moved through it all like he had created the world and was simply checking on his work. When the concert ended, the lights came up. People turned to each other, breathless, trying to process what they had just witnessed. But Prince himself was already gone. No goodbyes, no lingering, just disappearance like a phantom slipping back into his own dimension. Paisley Park, his legendary compound, was the heart of that dimension. To outsiders, it was a studio, a mansion, a creative sanctuary. To those who had been inside, it felt more like a private universe that existed under one man's absolute will. Doors stayed locked. Curtains remained drawn. Schedules shifted according to his impulses, not the clock on the wall. Prince wrote, recorded, and produced much of his music alone. Anyone hired to work near him understood the unspoken rule: perfection or exile. It was said that a single missed note could get you fired on the spot. A former assistant once claimed that Prince didn't need anyone but himself and the echo of his own voice bouncing off the studio walls. Over the years, he discovered and shaped several young women into stars: Vanity, Apollonia, Kat, Sheila E., Carmen Electra. Each story started like a miracle, the kind aspiring artists dream of. And each one, in its own way, ended like a nightmare. Vanity, his first great muse and lover, was given everything by him: a name, a band, a look, a persona, even a way to smile for the cameras. But when she demanded her own freedom, it was reported that Prince cut her off completely. He reclaimed songs, distanced himself from her career, and let her fall out of his orbit. She slipped into addiction, lost her footing, and died in 2016, just months before he did. Apollonia, star of Purple Rain, later said Prince tried to control every breath she took. According to her, he forbade her from dating, from opening up to the press, from making important choices without his approval. When the film ended and the premiere lights went down, Prince didn't argue or fight. He simply walked away from her life. Sheila E., the brilliant drummer who many believed was his musical equal, revealed later that Prince wanted to own me like a song. It was said he dictated her lyrics, her sound, and even her wardrobe. When she finally signed a solo deal on her own terms, he didn't confront her. He just vanished from her world. But power at that level came at a cost. Years of high-heeled performances and intense shows left Prince with excruciating hip pain. To endure it, he relied on painkillers. Over time, he became dependent on them. According to investigators and medical reports, he used aliases to fill prescriptions. The more his body hurt, the more pills he took. The more he took, the more he pushed himself to keep performing as if nothing was wrong. On the 21st of April 2016, Prince was found unconscious in an elevator at Paisley Park. Efforts to revive him failed. The autopsy later revealed fentanyl, a powerful painkiller far stronger than morphine, in his system. He died alone in a locked mansion, surrounded by thousands of unreleased recordings, songs that would never hear the light of day in his lifetime. Tina Turner never forgot the shock that rippled through the music world when the news broke. To her, Prince personified the evil of total obsession. He didn't just harm others, in her eyes. He turned his genius inward, consuming himself piece by piece. He wasn't destroyed by enemies. He was destroyed by a god he had built inside his own reflection. 10. Michael Jackson, the fallen angel. For Tina Turner, evil in the music industry didn't always wear the face of a villain. Sometimes it wore the face of a boy who once made the whole world cry. Michael Jackson, the man crowned the king of pop, was, in her view, the most terrifying proof that the industry could devour even its purest stars. She remembered seeing Michael backstage in 1988. He was at the height of his fame, but what she saw wasn't triumph. He was thin, almost fragile, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes so dark they looked hollow, like they were carrying a weight no one could see. Not long after, the world watched as police raided his Neverland Ranch over allegations of child abuse. The estate that had been built as a fantasy kingdom, a place of amusement rides, toys, and stuffed animals, suddenly appeared on television screens as a crime scene. Helicopters hovered overhead. Reporters dissected every detail. The boy who had once been the symbol of innocence now stood at the center of a global storm. Tina was said to have summed it up with one chilling sentence: "That boy once sang to save the world, but the world turned him into a monster." She wasn't speaking as a judge in a courtroom, but as someone who had seen what the machine could do to a human soul. To her, Michael Jackson became the final result of evil in music, not necessarily because of what he was accused of, but because of what the system did to him. He was the endpoint of a path where talent is exploited until the person behind it collapses, where the soul is crushed under contracts, expectations, and unending scrutiny, and where fame itself stops being a reward and becomes a life sentence. So now the question is yours to answer. What do you think? Were Michael Jackson and the other legends on Tina Turner's list simply victims of fame, fragile people broken by a system too powerful to resist? Or are they proof that in this world, no one climbs all the way to glory without leaving